Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthologies. Written by Dr. Jeffrey A. Robinson and narrated by Melissa Del Toro Schaffner. Part 2. His quest was to find the source of all these fables, creatures, which would prove to be the masters of time. As I listened to Victor, I didn't give any credence to his story, but was amazed by the incredible detail of his account. Still, many of the items in his rambling tale rang true. That was the nature of delusion. Tiny truths get stitched together into fantasies. Still, many of his observations about the nature of matter and energy were correct, and had not been verified until just a few years before. Indeed, I recalled reading that the magnetic pole drifts about 15 kilometers per year, and that the alignment of crystals in rock showed Earth's magnetic poles had moved great distances over millennia. Perhaps Victor had read such facts in science magazines, and incorporated them into his fantasies in hindsight. I wondered what Victor had really been before his head injury. Had he been a disgruntled science teacher or a frustrated scientist under the communists? His vocabulary and fluency in several languages indicated a high level of education. I decided to ask Dr. Brzezinski his opinion before I left. When I returned my attention back to Victor, I discovered he hadn't stopped talking. He was deeply involved in his tale about crossing the bleak and desolate forests of northern Russia, while on his way to explore the northern magnetic pole. He rattled on. I knew, of course, that our compasses would not work because of the powerful magnets which I carried with me. I therefore determined our position each day using a sextant. After more than a month winding our way north, we crossed the 60th parallel and the first winter snows began. It was then my porters decided they'd had enough. In preceding days, the weather had grown colder and the snows deeper. Moreover, many of them had increasing fears about the expedition. Some had experienced vivid nightmares of impending doom. I told them we would go just a little further, but that night one of the men died horribly in his sleep. His dying scream woke the camp. There was no mark on the man, but his face had frozen in a twisted grimace of terror. My efforts to reassure them were unsuccessful. They left that night, disappearing into the night. Ignoring my orders, they left me with only my personal supplies, a single horse, and one pack of food. I almost turned back then, but pressed on instead. However, that evening, I too began to experience vivid, terrifying dreams. At the same time, I thought it was due to stress, but I later came to understand that the creatures I sought were contacting me, trying to make me turn back. They do not like human contact, you see, Dr. Christoph. That's why they live out in the remote wilderness, with the ability to affect men's minds. They have built a shield around themselves, a barrier reflected in stories and myths of magic. They can hide themselves from our eyes and make men look the other way, so men will not notice them. If strangers approach, they simply touch men's minds and make them want to go somewhere else. Despite my nightmares, I continued on. Eventually, however, I lost my way. The weather turned bad, and I could not see the sun through the low gray clouds. I could not determine my location, nor my direction of travel. Finally, one night my horse ran off in terror. I figured I must be close, and headed in the opposite direction the horse had fled. I pressed on until my food ran out, and I began to have dreams and hallucinations even when I was awake. Their abilities at mind control are formidable, Dr. Christoph. They did everything they could to turn me away. I don't remember things too clearly at this point. I suffered from hunger, exposure, and constant assault by these beings. I vaguely remember arguing with them as they offered me power and wealth. I tried to ignore them when they threatened me with horrible punishment if I did not turn back. It was obvious that only the strong magnets in my pack prevented them from totally controlling my mind. I had to fight constantly to remember my purpose. They twisted my memories and played with my emotions whenever I dropped my guard. Continuing forward was the hardest thing I have ever done. For some reason, they feared me. Perhaps they simply feared what I carried. I dared not sleep anymore since I knew they'd take over my mind while I slept. I fought off sleep and desperately continued deeper into the Russian wilderness. Finally, I came to a place in the forest where the trees grew very close together. The trees were larger than anything I'd ever seen before. From their size, they must have been ancient, hundreds of years old at least. They were so large and so close together, I could hardly proceed on foot. The leaves overhead were so thick, snow no longer covered the ground, and everything on the forest floor was shrouded in shadows as deep as night. It was then that I saw them. They appeared as a host of small dark shadows that skittered about, trying to hide from view. I saw them most clearly at the edge of my vision. Dr. Christoph, I now believe they lose the ability to cloud your mind when you deprive yourself of sleep. I was extremely lucky to have gotten so far. Finally, I came to the largest tree of all, and I knew I'd found their lair. Since I had long since accepted that I would never return home alive, my only intention was to somehow upset their mysterious purpose of deluding men's minds. From the images they had pressed into my mind, I knew them to be the ultimate evil. It's not that they hate mankind, you see. They're not even a part of our reality. Since they have no material form, they're not really part of our world. From my dreams, I'd come to understand them a little. They have their own designs and plans. Their purpose has nothing to do with man whatsoever. To them, man is just a nuisance, an annoyance. You see, Doctor, if time is like a string, then the past, the present, and the future are just different points on the string, and they all exist simultaneously. Man is part of the string, but these creatures are not. They're like spiders running along the string to get to a point much farther along it. They're just traveling along it for some unimaginable past and are headed to some undreamed-of future. As they pass along the string, however, man's perceptions are somehow focused on them. Awareness is caught up in their passing, like pieces of paper that are dragged along by a passing carriage. Whether this is part of their intent or a mere side effect, I do not know. What I do know is that the effect of their work distorts man's perceptions and blinds him to the true nature of time. Perhaps this makes things more predictable for them. If man could perceive the future or accurately remember the past, maybe reality would be different. Maybe blinding man simplifies and restricts the possible futures further along the string of time, and this in turn somehow serves their purpose. In any case, I decided to thwart their plans. They'd violated my mind and tried to destroy me for no other reason than that I'd noticed them. I knew my death was inevitable, and therefore resolved to hurt them in a final act of defiance. I knelt at the base of the largest tree. At a huge wall of black wood so wide I couldn't even guess its width. I dug the giant magnet out of my pack and placed the device against the tree. As I did so, I heard their collective cry of anguish and pain. The shadows assailed me and tried one last time to control my mind. So weary from lack of sleep was I, however, that they could not hold my thoughts. I laughed and prepared the chemical batteries, which would generate a massive electrical current through the wire windings and amplify the magnetic field 1,000-fold. As I reached for the trigger, their soundless cries changed to a plea. I hesitated, and then regained my resolve, reaching again for the switch. Their plea transformed itself into a withering wave of hatred, and the world spun around me. I felt myself tearing loose from the world and propelled at great speed, though I did not move. Then I glimpsed them clearly for the first time. I screamed and collapsed, but somehow closed the switch. The last thing I remember is a tremendous explosion. I must have blacked out. To this day, I don't know exactly what happened. I'm told I was found wandering along a backwoods Russian road. I was bleeding badly from a large wound on my head and was suffering from severe dehydration. Since I had no identification and only seemed to speak Polish, I was sent here. All my memories were gone. It was 6 months before I even remembered my name. Later, I discovered I'd been hurled nearly a century into the future. I have no explanation of how this might have occurred, but it matches the accounts I've read about these creatures' abilities. During the past several months, I've slowly puzzled out what happened, and that's why I wrote you, Dr. Christoph. With your expertise on the nature of time, you're one of the few people who might understand what I've discovered and recognize what it means. I looked at the poor man, unable to think of what to say. He was obviously sincere, but equally delusional. Victor held out some magazine articles and offered them to me. The pictures were of a forest, with the trees all knocked down, like matchsticks in a wind. This is where I was. Look, see the date and the location? The attached article was an account of the still unexplained 1909 explosion, which leveled hundreds of square miles of wilderness forests. What makes you think this has anything to do with you? I asked him, handing back the papers. Because that is where I was, he said. By my last calculations, I was almost exactly at that spot when I triggered my magnetic bomb. My device must have disrupted the source of power and caused that blast, hurling me 100 years out of my own time as well. I shook my head in amazement. This is meaningless, I said, handing him back the pictures. It proves nothing. Besides, this event happened at least 5 years after your alleged expedition. Yes, that's true. But remember, just before I triggered the magnetic bomb, I was overcome with a sensation of hurling at fantastic speed without moving. The creatures had already ripped me loose from the world and were propelling me through time. In the mere seconds it took me to reach for the switch, years passed. That's probably the only reason I survived the blast. I was not completely in this reality when the explosion occurred. Victor's face grew grim, and his eyes narrowed as he spoke. I've puzzled over this last part the longest. At first, I couldn't figure out what caused the explosion. He then tapped his head and grinned wickedly. But I finally realized the secret was the grove of trees. When I was in the forest, I didn't realize the significance of the trees. Think, Dr. Christoph, if these creatures are apart from this world, why was that grove of trees so important to them? What if their devices, the machines they use to drag themselves into the future, have to be powered by some form of energy? That's the secret of trees. The trees provide that energy, life force itself. Victor grew agitated and gestured wildly. In the same way they can affect men's minds, these creatures must have some way of drawing the life force from those gigantic ancient plants. They use that energy to control men's minds and to propel themselves along the strands of time. That's why holy groves and ancient trees play so heavily in ancient religions. Don't you see? Victor wrung his hands together. "I hurt them, Dr. Christoph, but I didn't stop them. They must have other engines on Earth. I don't know where they are, but I suspect there must be one near the southern magnetic pole." His eyes focused on me with terrifying intensity. "Together, Dr. Christoph, we can locate and destroy them. You must help me locate these monstrous engines of time and rid ourselves of these creatures that shroud our thoughts and control our minds." He grabbed my coat jacket. "Please, Dr. Christoph, we don't have much time. They've already found me again." I fought him back, knocking over my chair. As I pried his fingers from my coat, I shouted, "Nurse, orderly, help! Anybody, help me!" and pushed him away. Victor backed away but continued to plea. "I can prove it, Dr. Christoph. I've stayed awake for 3 days and nights now and have begun to see them again out of the corners of my eyes. They've found me, but they can't hurt me. Here, I'll show you why." As I scrambled to move the wooden chair, I glanced at Victor and saw him open his ratty gray robe. He had attached dozens of tiny objects to the inside of the robe. Some were tied with little pieces of string, some were pinned. They were of various shapes and sizes, but I couldn't tell what they were. "They're magnets, Dr. Christoph. They're tiny little magnets. I got some from the refrigerator in the activity room. Others I stole from the little boards the doctors use to track their duty status. I've stole some and bartered with other patients for the rest. I've covered myself in magnets to protect me, and that's the only reason I'm still alive." He closed his robe quickly and looked frantically at the corners of the room. "You believe me now, don't you, Dr. Christoph? You understand, right?" I didn't get the chance to answer. The door flew open as several hospital attendants burst into the room. In seconds, Victor was pinned to his bed, and I was hustled out into the hallway. As hospital staff escorted me down the hall, I heard Victor screaming behind me. Minutes later, I recounted Victor's story to the hospital administrator as I sipped a brandy in his office. I told him about Victor's bizarre claims and his ridiculous account. I then told him about Victor's obsession with magnets, and that he'd apparently forced himself to remain awake for days without sleep. Dr. Brzezinski apologized profusely and assured me nothing like this had ever happened with Victor before. "Normally, Victor is very quiet and gentle. I don't understand what's gotten into him." As the calming effects of the brandy took effect, I regained my composure and suggested, "Perhaps Victor is just suffering from sleep deprivation. Perhaps all he needs is sleep." I joked with the doctor as I left, admitting I'd gotten myself into the situation and that it wasn't his fault. We parted cordially, and I asked him to be gentle with Victor. I even requested Dr. Brzezinski to stay in touch and let me know of Victor's progress. I hardly remember my drive back to my hotel room. I retired after having a few more strong drinks. In the morning, as I packed for my plane to Rome, I jotted a quick note to Dr. Brzezinski apologizing again for causing such an incident. I left him the address of the hotel where I could be reached in Rome, and then put the matter out of my mind. In Rome, I buried myself in my lecture schedule, and I didn't think of the episode again. On the final day of my lectures, however, I received a letter at my hotel. It was a lengthy note from Dr. Brzezinski. In it, he regretted to inform me that the man who had called himself Victor Christoph had died the night I'd left Poland. The administrator had stripped Victor of his magnets and given him a sedative to make him sleep. Victor had fought with the orderlies so aggressively that they'd had to restrain him. The next morning, when they went to wake, they found him dead. Unfortunately, the local authorities had difficulties with the case. While there was no evidence of foul play in Victor's death, the coroner was reluctant to declare his death the result of natural causes. Dr. Brzezinski asked if I would provide a statement to the local police to assist him. The news of Victor's death saddened me, but I didn't understand the nature of the coroner's problem until I looked at the photographs that accompanied Brzezinski's letter. The pictures showed Victor's room with his body still restrained in his bed. However, in Victor's place lay the wasted husk of an incredibly old man instead of a man in his late 30s. I could not believe the gaunt skeletal form tied to the bed could possibly have been the younger man I'd met just a few days before. On the desk next to the bed, where I remembered Victor setting down his papers and notes, was a pile of ash, as if the papers had aged and crumbled into dust. I reread the letter over and over again. Finally, I drafted a reply to Dr. Brzezinski saying that I'd be glad to provide a statement recounting the events. I added, however, that any further correspondence should be addressed to the Los Alamos labs. I then cut short my lecture tour and immediately booked flights to return home. As I write this account, I've now been awake for more than 50 hours, and am not sure how much longer I can stay awake. I've been drinking coffee nonstop for the past several hours, and should arrive in at the lab in about 4 more hours. I'm not sure how Victor aged a century overnight, and I'm not saying any of his claims were true. However, I'm terrified he may indeed have leapt forward a century from his own time. I don't know how much longer I can stay awake, and regret not purchasing magnets to carry with me on board the plane. If I don't make it back, I wanted to leave this account for someone to know what happened. All of the other passengers are asleep as I write this log on my laptop. Recently, I've begun to see flickering shadows and shapes at the edge of my vision, and have the eerie sensation of distant laughter coming from them. I'm confident the shadows can't take control of my mind as long as I stay awake, but I don't know whether the pilots or the crew are safe. In any case, I won't feel safe until I return to the quantum mechanics lab where I work. In my lab, we use very strong magnets in our experiments, large superconducting magnets that can create some of the strongest magnetic fields on Earth. All I have to do is to stay awake until I get there. I know if I can just make it back to the lab, that it'll be safe for me to sleep. Thank you for listening. We love our listeners, fans, and patrons. If you loved what you heard, please like and subscribe to our audio anthology, and consider visiting our Patreon site at www.patreon.com/Melissa Del Toro voiceover. If you'd like to read more of the stories in the Untold Tales series, not narrated here on our podcast, you can find Jeff's books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. The links for all of this information are conveniently listed in this episode's show notes. Thank you and have a wonderful day.